This was how food became an industrial product. It was integrated into daily life as a matter of convenience. The physical effects emerged quietly over decades. This was not an isolated shift, but a deliberate recalibration. The food that previous generations had grown, prepared, and eaten had been systematically replaced by something engineered for different priorities: shelf life, distribution efficiency, profit margin. What people actually needed to thrive was never the primary consideration. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was simply how industrial systems operate when left to optimize for their own survival rather than human welfare. The companies involved weren't hiding their intentions. They genuinely believed they were solving problems. The issue was that the problems they solved were logistical and financial, not nutritional or biological. The human body, with its complex requirements built over millions of years of evolution, was treated as an afterthought in a system designed around transportation networks and quarterly earnings. The changes began in the post-war period, when industrial capacity built for military production needed new markets. Factories that had produced rations for soldiers were retooled to produce food for civilians. The techniques were the same: strip ingredients down to stable components, add preservatives, package for maximum durability. What worked for feeding troops in uncertain conditions became the template for feeding families in peacetime. The infrastructure was already built, the expertise was already developed, the momentum was already established. At the time, this was considered progress. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and the promise of convenience foods seemed like liberation from hours spent in the kitchen. Advertisements showed smiling families gathered around tables filled with colorful boxes and cans. The message was clear: modern food for modern life. Traditional preparation methods were portrayed as outdated, inefficient, something your grandmother did because she didn't know better. The new products came with the authority of science, the promise of nutrition, and the appeal of simplicity.
The transition happened in stages, each one feeling minor at the time. Fresh milk from local dairies gave way to homogenized versions from regional processing plants. Bread baked daily in neighborhood bakeries was replaced by factory-produced loaves wrapped in plastic designed to last a week or more without spoiling. Vegetables grown in backyard gardens were supplemented, then largely replaced by canned and frozen alternatives shipped from distant industrial farms. Each substitution seemed reasonable in isolation. Each one solved an immediate practical problem. Taken together, they represented a fundamental restructuring of how humans obtained nutrition. Most people didn't question it. The changes aligned with broader cultural shifts toward efficiency, standardization, and trust in institutional expertise. Doctors endorsed many of these products. Schools served them to children. Government agencies approved them. The entire system reinforced the message that this was normal, safe, and even superior to what came before. Questioning it would have required not just individual skepticism, but a willingness to challenge multiple pillars of post-war American society simultaneously. The ingredients themselves underwent transformation. Wheat was refined to remove the bran and germ, leaving only the endosperm. The vitamins and minerals removed in this process were then added back synthetically, and the result was labeled enriched, as if it had been improved rather than degraded and partially restored. Oils were extracted from seeds using industrial solvents, then chemically altered to remain stable at room temperature. Sugar, once a precious commodity used sparingly, became so cheap through industrial refining that it could be added to nearly everything, including products that weren't even sweet. This wasn't discussed openly. The technical details of food processing existed in industry publications and regulatory documents that ordinary people never saw. What appeared on grocery store shelves was the finished product, packaged attractively, priced competitively, and marketed with the full force of America's advertising industry. The story consumers received was about convenience, modernity, and scientific advancement. The story they didn't receive was about the specific molecular changes that had occurred, the nutrients that had been removed, and the compounds that had been added. Most people never noticed this at the time. The changes were too gradual, too normalized, too embedded in institutions that people trusted. A parent buying cereal for their children in 1965 had no reason to know that the product contained significantly more sugar than would have been considered acceptable a generation earlier, or that many of the vitamins listed on the box existed in synthetic forms that the human body processed differently than their natural counterparts. That information wasn't hidden exactly, but it wasn't highlighted either. The pattern repeated across categories. Meat production shifted from small farms where animals lived on pasture to concentrated feeding operations where thousands were raised in confinement, fed grain-based diets that fattened them quickly but altered the nutritional profile of their meat. The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio shifted. The vitamin content changed. The fat composition became different. But a steak was still called a steak. The labels stayed the same even as the underlying reality transformed. It seemed too small to matter back then. Individual ingredient substitutions, slight changes in processing methods, minor reformulations to reduce costs or extend shelf life. No single change was dramatic enough to trigger alarm. But food, unlike other consumer products, is consumed daily in significant quantities for an entire lifetime. Small changes, repeated thousands of times over decades, accumulate into something substantial. Children born into this system had no reference point for what came before. To them, brightly colored breakfast cereals were normal. Processed cheese slices were normal. Soda with every meal was normal. Snack foods engineered for maximum craving were normal. They had no memory of food that tasted differently because it was grown differently, raised differently, prepared differently. The baseline had shifted, and with it, the expectations.
The real impact appeared years later, not in sudden, obvious ways that would have made the connection clear, but in slow, steady increases in conditions that seemed unrelated to food because the effects were diffuse and multifactorial. Rates of obesity began climbing in the 1970s and never stopped. Diabetes diagnoses increased year after year. Cardiovascular disease remained the leading cause of death even as other medical advances extended lifespans. Autoimmune conditions became more common. None of these outcomes could be traced to a single cause. Human health is too complex for simple explanations. But the timeline was suggestive. The generation that grew up eating industrially processed foods showed different health patterns than the generations that came before. By the time these patterns became statistically undeniable, they had also become normalized. Carrying extra weight was common enough to seem normal. Taking medication for chronic conditions was standard. Feeling tired or unwell most of the time became something people simply accepted as part of modern life. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. Not just individual habits, but structural ones. The entire food supply chain had been reorganized around industrial processing. Grocery stores were designed to display packaged goods, not fresh produce. Restaurants relied on pre-prepared ingredients from food service companies. School cafeterias received commodities through federal programs that prioritized crop surpluses over nutritional quality. Even well-intentioned efforts to improve nutrition often relied on industrial products marketed as healthier alternatives. The economic structure made reversal difficult. Farmers had specialized in commodity crops that fed into industrial processing. Small-scale agriculture that produced diverse, nutrient-dense foods for local consumption had largely disappeared, unable to compete economically with industrial operations.
The knowledge of how to grow, raise, and prepare traditional foods had faded as multiple generations relied on processed alternatives. Even people who wanted to eat differently found themselves constrained by what was available, what was affordable, and what they knew how to do. This wasn't about individual choices or personal responsibility. Those frameworks emerged later as public health officials and food companies sought to deflect attention from systemic issues. The narrative became about willpower, education, and making better decisions, as if the fundamental transformation of the food supply was irrelevant and people simply needed to try harder. But individuals operating within a system designed to optimize for corporate profitability rather than human health were never going to produce population-level outcomes consistent with well-being. The problem was structural, not personal. The regulatory apparatus that might have intervened was compromised by design. The agencies tasked with food safety were chronically underfunded and heavily influenced by the industries they supposedly regulated. Scientists whose research raised concerns about specific ingredients or processes found their funding threatened. The revolving door between regulatory agencies and food companies ensured that officials often had more loyalty to industry interests than public health. Meanwhile, marketing budgets dwarfed anything available for public health education. Billions of dollars went toward making processed foods appealing, familiar, and emotionally resonant. Brands became part of cultural identity. Children were specifically targeted with cartoon characters and toy promotions, creating brand loyalty that would persist into adulthood. The message that eating for health might require rejecting these products never had equivalent resources behind it. The scientific establishment was slow to recognize the magnitude of the problem, partly because the research paradigm itself was poorly suited to the question. Nutrition science had developed around identifying deficiencies, finding the minimum amounts of nutrients needed to prevent obvious disease. It was good at preventing scurvy and rickets. It was much less equipped to evaluate the long-term effects of consuming foods that met minimum nutrient requirements while introducing novel compounds and altered ratios. Researchers tried to raise alarms. Studies emerged showing correlations between processed food consumption and various health outcomes. But correlation isn't causation, and the food industry was expert at exploiting that distinction. They funded their own studies, often designed to produce null results. They emphasized the complexity of human health, the difficulty of isolating variables. All of these points were technically valid, but they were deployed strategically to prevent any conclusion that might threaten profitability. Generational knowledge eroded systematically. Grandparents who remembered cooking from scratch died, and their skills died with them. Children raised on convenience foods became parents who didn't know how to do anything else. The sensory memory of what real food tasted like faded from collective experience. Tomatoes bred for durability rather than flavor became the standard. When people encountered foods produced traditionally, they sometimes found them strange, too intense, unfamiliar. The economic incentives all pointed in the same direction. Commodity crops like corn, wheat, and soy received government subsidies, making them artificially cheap. Processing added value and increased profit margins. Long shelf life reduced waste and allowed for complex distribution networks. Every step away from whole foods and toward industrial processing made economic sense for the companies involved, even as it moved further away from what human bodies had evolved to consume. Public health advice reflected and reinforced these economic realities. The food pyramid, introduced in the 1990s as official dietary guidance, recommended 6 to 11 servings of grain per day, primarily from refined sources. It placed fats and oils in the tiny category to be used sparingly, even though humans require certain fats for proper functioning. The entire framework seemed designed to support agricultural subsidies and food industry interests, rather than optimal human nutrition. The social infrastructure of food changed as fundamentally as the food itself. Families stopped eating together as schedules fragmented. The kitchen, once the center of the home, became primarily a place to reheat and store packaged goods. Children grew up without learning to cook, without understanding where food came from, without developing the sensory discrimination to recognize quality. Medical education largely ignored nutrition, devoting minimal time to it in curricula focused on pharmaceutical interventions. Doctors graduated knowing how to treat disease symptoms, but rarely understanding how food influences health at a fundamental level. When patients developed diet-related conditions, the standard approach was medication, not dietary change. The entire healthcare system was oriented toward managing illness rather than preventing it. The few voices that argued for returning to traditional foods were often marginalized as extremists or elitists. Organic agriculture was dismissed as inefficient and unable to feed large populations, even as industrial agriculture produced mountains of subsidized commodity crops used primarily for processed foods rather than direct human nutrition. The economic and political power behind the industrial food system ensured that alternatives remained niche, expensive, and inaccessible to most people. The knowledge of what real food tasted like, looked like, and made people feel like was disappearing. The sensory baseline had shifted so dramatically that returning to traditional foods required retraining the palate, relearning cooking skills, and accepting that real food was more expensive and less convenient than the industrial products that had replaced it. And this wasn't the only change. The transformation of food was part of a broader pattern that touched every aspect of life. Similar decisions followed. That pattern didn't stop there.